What are the colonial legacies in Burkina Faso? In this video, I will discuss how colonialism and its lasting impacts resulted in Burkina Faso's food insecurity, the Burkinabe government's frail institutional design, and intervention from external forces and past colonial powers. Furthermore, I will talk about alliances between countries within the Sahel region to mitigate food insecurity and to bolster the economies and militaries of the countries in the region. Earlier this semester, in Chapter 15, we discussed colonialism. In the chapter, colonialism is described as the direct control and formal political rule of a subject population by a foreign power. Colonizers sought to exploit the physical, human, and economic resources of an area to benefit the colonizing nation. Prior to colonization, there was significant economic growth in Western Africa. However, with the advent of colonialism, economic growth in the region was stunted. Additionally, the sole focus on cash crop growth in the Ivorian economies impeded upon their economic diversification. In West Africa, the French focused completely on their colonies' crop growth for the export market and did not care about the subsistence farming needs of the people within the colonies. An example of this is the French reduction of millet and sorghum growth in their colonies, and instead, they promoted the growth of cocoa and cotton. By solely focusing on the growth of a select few crops, Europeans had an extremely detrimental impact on the West African economy. As a result of this economic harm, in the 1960s, following the fracturing of the colonies into individual nations, with the arrival of their independence, the countries were frequently reliant on economic and government intervention from external forces. Often the intervening external powers were the previous colonizers of these Sahel nations, making it evident that they still had their grip on these supposed independent nations. Unrest and coups in Burkina Faso have been an overarching theme in the Burkinabe government since its establishment as its own nation. As mentioned earlier, this trend of unrest was heavily influenced by the French colonizers' impediment on the Burkinabe development of a well-rounded institutional design. After gaining its independence, without redundancies and other defenses to provide for protection against political unrest and military coups, the trend of overthrowing Burkina Faso leaders has remained to this day. Maurice Yameogo, the first president of Burkina Faso, faced significant opposition from the public due to a limitation of workers' rights in 1966. In 1967, after the first of the country's many military coups, Captain Sangoulé Lamizana replaced Yameogo as president. Soon after, however, in 1976, Lamizara's government was eradicated, and again, there was a military coup that resulted in the dissolution of Burkina Faso's constitution. This gave way to the beginning of the country's rule via military junta, meaning a government led by military leaders. The lack of balance of powers in the Burkina Faso government, facilitated by French colonization, proved to make the Burkina Faso leadership institutions extremely fragile. Military coups have continued in Burkina Faso with the overthrowing of Thomas Sankara in 1987 and a coup in 2022, with the removal of President Damiba from office, who was replaced by President Traoré, the current president of Burkina Faso. Despite its extremely turbulent past, Burkina Faso and Sahel nations have seemed to turn a new leaf with their recent alliances. In September of 2023, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger signed the Alliance of Sahel States, or AES. There were many reasons for the signing of the AES, one of which being the increasing prevalence of jihadist insurgencies, fostered by the NATO intervention in Libya, which was headed by the French. According to MIT Press, NATO and its allies aided the rebels who rejected the peaceful path and who instead sought to overthrow the Libyan leader in charge at the time, Gaddafi. Such assistance to rebels significantly extended the war and magnified the harm to civilians, contrary to the intent of the UN authorization. A negative externality related to NATO's intervention directly impacting the power of radical Islamists in the Sahel region was the flow of weapons taken from Gaddafi, which instead of being destroyed, were released to underground markets. In Niger, for example, Boko Haram got their hands on man-pads, which are man-portable surface-to-air missiles. In Mali, which had been peaceful at the time prior to NATO's intervention, they suffered a massive increase in radical Islamists and experienced a civil war. Particularly because of the role that the French played in NATO's intervention and the collateral damage that it caused in the Sahel region, there has been a significant increase in anti-French sentiments. Further exacerbating the issue, French forces actually increased in numbers to suppress the radical Islamists following the increase in jihadist attacks. Due to the weak forces of these countries, which was heavily influenced by the French to begin with, Burkina Faso and the other Sahel nations have had an extremely difficult time removing the French presence in their countries. The signing of the Alliance of Sahel States was heavily influenced by this desire for stronger military and security. However, there were economic influences as well. Mali's defense minister said, "This alliance will be a combination of military and economic efforts among the three countries. This alliance will further the efforts of the alliance between Guinea, Mali, and Burkina Faso in February of 2023. The goal of the February alliance was to be a basis for fuel and electricity exchanges, cooperation on mineral extraction, and rural development and trade, hopefully leading to internal betterment of the Sahel economy." Although there have been significant efforts at internal betterment over the course of the last 3 years in Burkina Faso, its progress has been continuously stunted by jihadist insurgencies. Specifically during the COVID pandemic, the country suffered a strong economic downturn. At this time, villages in Burkina Faso, who relied on the economy's success to fuel their exports of cotton and gold, were particularly vulnerable. In 2022, taking advantage of this vulnerability, there was an increase in jihadist insurgencies in these villages. Amidst the insurgencies, blockades have been implemented by the armed groups, and food insecurity has increased significantly as a result. This crisis again left Burkina Faso reliant on the help of external forces despite the popular dislike of the West. In 2023, Burkina Faso signed an arrangement with the IMF under the Extended Credit Facility. Additionally, the IMF said, Burkina Faso faces protracted balance of payment problems, reflecting large development needs and the impact of shocks such as the COVID-19 pandemic, adverse weather conditions, deteriorating domestic security, and the food insecurity crisis. These shocks have disrupted economic activity, affected livelihoods, and exacerbated macroeconomic imbalances. This 4-year agreement with the IMF does not appear to be a step in the direction of economic independence. It is yet to be determined if the Sahel countries, and more specifically Burkina Faso, will be able to facilitate the development of a strong nation independent of Western intervention and escape their dependence on previous colonial powers.